Well, Mikhail Grigorьевич already introduced me, so thank you for that. Today we will be talking about a very, I would say, hot topic about the political economy of pandemics in general, the lessons that we can learn from the past, and also about the current situation. And since I'm a political scientist, of course, much will be said from the view of the political science and economics.
So, just give me 1 more minute. There's something I probably have forgotten introducing Professor Rosenberg. Dina Yanovna is in charge of the research seminar, and she is exactly the person who makes life at the program bearable. She is helping you with your papers, and she is doing it in a very friendly way, though you will all be dealing with quite hard subjects, including, well, this, the political economy of global pandemics.
Yes, that's hopefully very true. If you come to the program, I will teach the research seminar, yes, where we'll be talking about different topics, but also I will help you with your thesis. So I have a quick question. Can you please give me the right to demonstrate the screen? Because I will need the presentation. I have some graphs. Yeah, just make me the organizer or something. So while it's happening, I have actually a question for everyone that I usually start my politics and economics of public health lecture with. So what is the deadliest animal to humans?
Human.
That's the second deadliest. What's the first one? Yes, you're right. So what's the first one? Think about Africa.
Oh, like viruses or some bacteria.
Yeah, and who transfers?
Mosquitoes.
Here we go. Yes. So that would be my first question. And the second one, who would be one of the scientists who saved a lot of lives? And by a lot, I mean around 500 million.
Maybe someone who came up with the penicillin.
If the logic is correct, yes, that would be one of them. Who else? Right now, this topic is being discussed. Yeah, but I mean, the logic is correct. So someone
who made up the vaccine.
Yes, who made the vaccine, and the one I'm talking about is just a second. The one I'm talking about is someone who invented the vaccine against smallpox. Edward Jenner. Yes, just a second, I still don't have the right to demonstrate the screen. It says to me that the organizer turned off everyone's right to demonstrate the screen. So this option is, no, that's allows me to record. That's something else that allows me to record the lecture. And I need...
Вадим, сделай Дину Яновну с организатором. Это решите нашу проблему.
That's awesome. Just 1 second. Okay, can you see the slides?
Да.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So medicine is a social science and politics is nothing but medicine on a grand scale. I really like this quote because I think it reflects the political and redistributive nature of medicine. And so what we see on this picture is the correlation between the wealth of the country and the nutrition, which is one of the indicators of, in general, health in the country, and also socioeconomic well-being of the country. Well, of course, you have probably studied, right, that correlation does not mean causation, and I'm totally with you on that. However, we do have some theoretical reasons why we would observe this correlation, and those would be causal reasons. So that's another graph that shows again the, well, a little bit non-linear, but still close enough, and kind of high correlation between wealth of the country and life expectancy, which is also a good measure of the health of the population. So there are theoretical reasons to believe why they are connected, but also there are more theoretical discussions which way causality goes, right? So we might assume that better health positively affects economic growth, and that's why we see positive correlation. But we also might think that it's about economic development causing better health within the population. Or to make matters worse, we might think that we have forgotten some third factor, right, that would be responsible for both countries getting wealthier and richer, and at the same people getting better health. So why we might think that good health causes economic development? Again, that's actually not only theoretical reasoning, but there are empirical papers that show this association. So for one, healthy people, they turned to have higher productivity, and then higher productivity leads to accumulation of economic wealth, economic growth, and at the end of the day, economic development. On the other hand, it was also shown that healthier people have better learning abilities, and then there are a lot of economic papers, right, that show the association between education and higher salaries, again, higher economic productivity, etc. On the other hand, we have good reasons to believe why in economically developed countries health outcomes would be better. So wealthy people can afford more food and food of higher quality. Also, wealthier people can afford more expensive healthcare. And for some countries, such as the US, it's actually a huge issue because they don't have that kind of universal health coverage. And of course, countries' wealth, if we are talking about developing countries versus the least developed countries, we are talking about better sanitary conditions, access to drinking water that a lot of poor countries still lack. The other factors that affect health outcomes in the population would be climate, culture, religion, and political institutions, and the outcomes of political institutions such as corruption. One political institution or set of political institutions that I would like to introduce, right, would be political regime. And there is an interesting thing that no famine, as was noticed by the Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, no famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy. Well, and of course, by famine, we mean kind of man-made right, man-caused and mass event. And I would like to remind you that, for example, the famine in communist China took away lives of 30 million people. Can you imagine? That's comparable. Well, that's of course to different according to different estimates, but that's comparable to the like worst wars in the history of the humankind. Well, of course, we are talking about, again, mass and man-made famine. We do realize that there are democracies and poor democracies where a lot of people do not have enough money, right, for food or for basic needs. So that would be the basics of the relationship between political institutions, economics, and health. Now I would like to draw some of the historical lessons from the pandemics. So the one that the current pandemics that we are, well, I would say unfortunate to witness would be the Spanish flu that occurred very swiftly in 1918, 1919. So that took away lives of 50 million people, and 500 million were sick with the virus. In contrast to this COVID virus, the Spanish flu caused high mortality among people 18-44 years old, so a different cohort. And in the US, it led to around 23% drop in industrial employment and around 18% drop in the output. So there is an interesting paper by Correira, Luck, and Werner in 2020, who showed empirically that in the US cities, those cities that quickly, so timely introduced strict lockdown, showed lower mortality and afterwards higher economic growth after the pandemic. And I was listening to the interview by Zigar with Oleg Itshoki, and he's the professor at Princeton University, and he told that actually, during the Spanish flu, when the scale of the epidemic was so huge that people, noticed, that their neighbors were dying, that their loved ones were dying nearby, they actually, even without governments imposed lockdown, they stayed at home. So that was kind of self-isolation to which they came, through the harsh experience. And another paper was that I think very interesting. It's still in progress, and I contacted the author where I can talk about it, Blickel. And Blickel told me that I can talk about it, but I should warn students that the results are preliminary. So he found that in Germany, in cities where the epidemic was worse, there were more votes for extremists in 1933 and anti-Jewish pogroms as well. Well, of course, you guys know history, and you might you might have rebuttals that probably wasn't the most important reason. And I would argue that probably yes, but still, the author, when he calculated this, he took into account all other important reasons why certain regions were more conducive to voting for the far rights. And actually, we will talk about it today a little bit, whether the current crisis will lead to a new wave of populism, right, or voting for far rights in Europe and worldwide or not. Another interesting paper showed that the people whose mothers had the flu while they were in the mother's womb, so when mothers were pregnant with those people, were less educated and earned less. But then there was another paper that refuted this one. What else happened during the these years, 1918, 1919? What was happening? That's the question to everyone.
There was a war.
Right.
First World War.
And which men usually are conscripted, drafted to war?
Noble, probably.
Noble, and that would be in terms of characteristics. So do you need to be healthy in order to go to war and fight for the country?
So yeah, like healthy man.
Yeah, so the healthiest, the fittest would be gone. So their theory would be, what if you take into account the characteristics of fathers, and we do know, right, the power of genetics. So if you take into account the characteristics of fathers, the connection between what Elmont found in his paper would be gone. So his argument is that that population, that cohort, is less healthier and less educated. That's not because of the flu, but that's because of the basically best men or best fathers were gone, best people, right? So, but this is kind of yet remains, this is an open question still. Well, this is just a graph to show that in those cities in the US during the Spanish flu that had timely and strict lockdowns, they were doing much better in terms of the mortality rate and GDP per capita afterwards. Another pandemic that we witnessed, but was not comparable to the one now, was Ebola in 2014, 2015. And it's interesting that the early forecasts were very scary in terms of the economics. Some economists would say that we would see a drop in GDP by like 200%, which never happened. And there is a paper that did a field experiment in Sierra Leone with 2 randomized accountability mechanisms. So some clinics were assigned a lot of checks by other professionals and specialists, and also in some clinics personnel who took care of the sick people with the Ebola. So they were assigned awards for their work. And so that was random, right? Random in terms of that the authors did not pick some specific clinics that were a priori better or something. The clinics were kind of on average characteristics, right? They were comparable, they were the same. So in this sense, the author's findings that in the experimental groups where these 2 mechanisms were introduced, mortality was lower and trust in doctors and medicine was higher. We are sure that we can attribute these findings to the experiment, to these 2 mechanisms. And another interesting consequence in economic terms and political terms would be the consequences of the plague, which, as all happened in the 14th century and took away, by different estimates, 1/3 or actually half of the European population. And that's somewhat of an economic miracle or economic riddle, that after this plague happened, we witnessed a modern kind of sharp growth, economic growth. And what's puzzling about that, why we call it a riddle, is that there were no kind of radical inventions that revolutionized the world during the Industrial Revolution, right? Or in the modern times. So there were no innovations to account for this growth or some other exogenous shocks like this. So why do we see it? And there is a very nice paper by Voigt, Flander, and Voss that was published in 2013, who propose 3 mechanisms why it happened. So one is that plug, because it led to the decline of population, that would be a sharp supply shock. And what usually happens if some commodity is in high deficit? What happens to the price of that product? If the product is in deficit, what happens to the price?
It rises.
Exactly. The price rises. So here the product that we are talking about is nothing else but labor, right? Because people were dying, so not enough people to produce labor. And the price of labor is nothing else but what? Salary. So salaries were rising. And because of that, people were able to, more and more people were able to move to cities. And that's how the kind of start of urbanization can be explained, and higher rate than expected might be explained. Then urbanization has the same logic, right? That in cities, mortality rate is higher. One reason is the density, right? High density, how people live, also sanitary conditions. So mortality was higher, and again, the same logic about labor price increasing and more people go into cities. And another reason would be wars, which actually happened according to Charles Tilly's estimates on average every 9 out of 10 years for 3 centuries from 15th to 18th century. That's a lot, right? So the world powers were constantly, fighting for land and economic talents. So because of that, actually, there was also population decline. And interesting fact is that most people died not on the battlefields, but actually because of the surrounding accompanying pandemics, so illnesses. Again, population decline and per capita income increased. So the saving rate increased, and that's one of the reasons how we can explain this economic riddle that I talked about. There is a political argument by 2 prominent political scientists that you probably heard about, Ajimolo and Robinson, who wrote a very nice book that I recommend to everyone. That's a cool read for ordinary people as well, not just political scientists. Why nations fail, it's called. So their logic is the following: is that once peasants became wealthier and wealthier, they were fighting for their economic rights, right? Because if you have wealth, you want property rights to work correctly in the country, correctly in a sense that your property would be protected from expropriation. Okay, so but then you probably know that you can easily convert economic resources to political resources, so money to power, and then it also works the other way around. You can convert political power to money. So in this sense, people, once peasants had economic rights, they wanted to protect them permanently. They wanted to protect them with institutions. So they were fighting for political rights. And in order for the crown to be able to give them political rights, they needed some third independent institution who would protect citizens from expropriation. And that would be what? That would be the parliament that we all know today. So that would be 3 kind of historical lessons about what we know about the pandemics, in a sense of some policies such as lockdown during the Spanish flu, and some interesting riddling consequences of other pandemics, such as the plague. So what do you know about COVID-19 today? I have delivered a piece of this lecture in April, and so because of the new information, I'm constantly updating it. So we do know that around 20 to 70% of the world's population might get it. And the mortality rate is around and even a little bit lower than 1% of cases. Also, we know that the proportion of asymptomatic patients is unknown, and that's actually one of the most important reasons why we don't, like, why the governments had, such hard time to determine which lockdowns and which policy measures to enforce and what the situation is, because we don't know how many people are carriers, right, and how many people are contagious. So if you look at the graph, that would be the case fatality rate that comes from a site that's called that is called 91DVOC, the spelling of COVID-19 backwards. You can, guys, log in. I mean, you can go to that website and see a lot of other cross-country, cross-national statistics. So you can see that Russia here in bold, it's actually doing fine, right, in comparison to many countries, but also it's doing worse, especially in the middle kind of the pandemic. So that probably was our second wave, doing worse than other countries, some European countries. But in general, there is a kind of tacit agreement that the Russian indicators are lower, from the official indicators are lower from the unofficial indicators by 2 or 3. But on the other hand, economists say that even if we multiply mortality that's happening, 2 to 3 times, Russia is still doing comparatively okay with other countries. So there is a huge debate, and was a huge debate, and still current, I think, is whether lockdown is a good remedy, or whether this is a situation when the pill is actually worse, right? The pill and its side effects is actually worse than the disease itself. So the reason why lockdowns and strict and timely lockdowns were propagated is not to put the end to pandemic, but that's actually the reason was what's called to smooth the curve and to relieve the burden in the hospitals, because not in all countries healthcare institutions were capable of fighting the pandemic. And please look at this graph. Look, that's the petitions or claims for unemployment benefits in the US, and the graph starts in 1970. Oh, that's 2020. Well, of course, that was during the panic, and that we can't compare things. That was in April, when things were happening, when there was a lot of uncertainty. So that would be, well, it's not the unemployment rate, right? Okay, that's the again, weekly initial jobless claims. So you can see this small red dot. That's what happened. That's what happened in the US in April. So lockdown again is needed to flatten the curve, not to put the end to the pandemic, and reduce the number of cases per day, so that first of all to relieve the health system, and second of all to gain some time to see the best way to treat the disease, and to have time for producing vaccines. again, as with Ebola, the most radical forecasts did not come true. For example, that economist from the Princeton University I was talking earlier about, Oleg Itshoki, he first introduced the numbers that the economy might fall by 40%, and it did not happen. So we don't have the numbers yet, but I think that the real numbers are much closer to more moderate forecasts put forward by the IMF and the World Bank. So probably the economy would shrink by 5 or 10%. Without lockdown during the first wave, mortality increased by 3-5 times instead of the predicted 1%. So that's, if you think kind of in about it in the real picture, that would be every 100th friend on Facebook, right? Which is a lot. So Itshoki was right, I think, predicting that probably there would be a strict lockdown, right, during the first wave, around 8 to 10 weeks. That actually what happened in Europe. And then in May and early June, a lot of lockdowns were lifted, the beaches were open, and everything was kind of becoming back to normal, right, until the second wave. Well, the people know that the second wave would come. It's just, what to do about it, because like restaurant business and other businesses that were under attack, at least they had the time to recover a little bit during the summer when cases were falling. So how do we know in economic terms what is worse, lockdown or no lockdown? So interestingly enough, there are already papers that calculated that in the US, for example, in the baseline scenario, so the difference between doing nothing and introducing lockdowns would be around $5 trillion, or according to another paper, $8 trillion, which is a lot, which is 35% of the US GDP. And interestingly, that two independent papers, right, from different authors, different universities, came to similar numbers. At times of uncertainty, this similarity, between different papers is usually kind of a good sign. Well, however, there is some outlier. I think Tsingalis calculated that it would be 65 trillion. That I would say too much. So how is this calculated? How do we know what's the difference between doing nothing and introducing lockdowns? So that's the difference between how many people's lives can be saved, right? And then we calculate how much is the value of statistical life. There is a term, VCL, the value of statistical life. And so how do we estimate it? How do we estimate how much a person's life costs? So there are different approaches. For example, that's how much people pay for their insurance, right? That's how much they themselves kind of value their lives. Also, the official compensation to the relatives of those killed in the emergency situations would be a good indicator of how the government values your life. Interestingly enough, in Russia, while in the US, the value of statistical life is more than $10 million. In Russia, it's about $100,000. So much less. And what's curious, that's according to Sberbank's estimates. But what is curious about that is that people in the survey, they would agree that this price of around like $6 million rubles, if we convert it to rubles, according to the volatile currency rate, they agree that that's kind of what it costs. That's fine. And according to Guriev's estimate in 2003, that should be much closer. The value of statistical life in Russia should be much closer to $2 million. Well, but again, remember the rate was different at that time. And the compensation from the government in those emergency cases that I talked about is around 1 million rubles. So around 5 million rubles short, right? Even according to Sberbank's estimates. So what did other countries decide? What did the countries, different countries decide in terms of this dilemma, in terms of this trade-off, whether to save the economy or, you know, whether to, well, basically save more people? So in the UK, there was that idea, right, that if only the senior population is the only one who faces this high risk of death, then why would we isolate everyone to the detriment of the economy if we can just isolate the high risk category? That sounded smart, right? But then they abandoned this idea about herd immunity coming fast, and some people would say that the UK is doing much worse than it could do if it didn't lose that 3 days. That 3 days, you know, were actually important when the reaction was needed as swift as possible. Japan was able to control growth of new infections so as not to overload the health system without strict lockdown. So there, because they were better prepared, as many other Asian countries, we will talk about it in a minute. So because they were better prepared, and also the health system, you know, is very high tech, and for other reasons, they did not see that huge overload of the healthcare system. So they didn't need kind of national lockdown. They were able to do it locally. So they were able to monitor the system. And once they saw that the system is overloaded or on the verge, being overloaded, they would call it a day and they would have a state of emergency for a little bit, but once the cases are falling a little bit, they would open up again. So, and of course, there are different people and different opinions, and there was an opinion that it's just the flu, right? And people would say, well, look, there are not so many deaths, and they would compare the statistics, early statistics from the COVID-19 to the statistics of the flu in the US. And sometimes flu seasons in the US are devastating. And so they would say, well, it's just the flu, you know, why there is a lockdown, why our freedoms are restricted, and why economy is suffering. And then other people will say, well, that's the point, right? That's exactly because of those lockdowns. That's why we see not so many deaths as we would otherwise. And of course, there were politicians who would also have this other view, well, starting with the president of the US, who already suffered for that in terms of the loss during the elections. So there were, local politicians who would say, okay, let's everybody get the damn thing and get it over with. So people kind of were fed up about it. And right now, even, you know, the US population is still really polarized, even about this pandemic. One kind of European experiment that some would call was Sweden, right? That decided to go forward without lockdown. And I remember that their main epidemiologist, he would say that, well, look at us, we would have herd immunity in May. Well, of course, that didn't happen. But what happened is that Sweden fared worse than its northern countries, and it's still the case today. I do have the numbers from April, but I looked at again yesterday. So still we have the same picture. The results are worse than those by the northern countries. Well, most comparable, right? That's why I take northern countries. And also interesting, and sad, is that the economic problems that Sweden faces actually are of the same scale that other European countries had that had lockdowns. Well, that's partly because of the global economy, right, and because of the European Union that Sweden is part of. On the other hand, to kind of give some credits to the Swedish policy, is that they, without strict lockdowns, they still have better results than France or Great Britain. especially during the first wave. And also what now the Swedish politicians are saying is that, well, look, actually Europe came to what we did, came to the decisions that we made during the first wave. They just don't admit it, but what they do now, kind of those, how to say, mild lockdowns, right? So you have to wear masks, but you can go to work. Well, you can't do social gatherings more than 100 people. Restaurants were open, but maybe not after 9 o'clock. So they have curfews in some countries that, yeah, you have to be home from, I don't know, 9 to 5 a.m. to exclude parties, etc., or gatherings of some people. But the country, like the economy, is still running. So Sweden would say, look, you guys are doing the same without calling it what we called it. So another thing that seems to be crucial for winning the pandemics, is mass testing. And again, there is a working paper that came to the conclusion that mass testing leads to lower mortality and better and lower economic costs. It also allows to trace the epidemiological characteristics of the virus and socioeconomic characteristics of people at high risk of infection. South Korea did it kind of first, and it has great results. Especially again during this first wave, it has kind of mobile even testing system. Taiwan and Singapore also adopted that. In terms of economic policy, what the government should have done and did in many European countries was that government support to people and to businesses, especially small and medium businesses, should be equal roughly the expected loss of GDP. That will be the rule of thumb by the economists. And so that's what Great Britain, USA, France, Malaysia, and Germany did. And about Russia, well, it did have some help that the population received, but there is discussion among economists. Some would say that, the Russian situation is not that bad in terms of the, general economic situation. We have low inflation, low government debt, and large reserves. So some economists would ardently argue that those reserves that we have should have been used to save the population from the pandemic, while, there are other voices who would say that it's the right thing that the government didn't use it because those reserves are for different purposes. Konstantin Sonin from the University of Chicago and from HSC as well argued that helicopter money was much needed. What's helicopter money? It's kind of a one-time unconditional transfers. Why unconditional? Unconditional meaning that the government wouldn't say that only those people who make less than this amount of money and other conditions and meet other conditions, only they would have this amount of money delivered by the government. So in times of crisis, there is no time for drafting this policy. There is no time. And so what Sonia said, that economists think that it's actually less costly to give just everyone that amount of money, right, than elaborating policy whom to give and whom not to give. And also, as you might imagine, the rich people who don't need that help probably would not risk their lives and go to get the money, or even would refuse from it, right? Of course, what was necessary is support for small and medium-sized businesses, direct payments, debt vacation, tax reliefs, etc. So this is the success formula, how it seems to look like, at least. And interesting that strict lockdown that is advised by many economists to the European countries was avoided. Some Asian countries were able to avoid it. There are reasons for that. And maybe we shouldn't copy that, because Asian countries, are better prepared due to previous pandemics, right? SARS, etc. They did mass testing because their economies, healthcare institutions are high tech. cleanliness standards, well, those of you who have been, for example, probably not to Japan and to South Korea, you guys might notice that people do wear masks a lot, just, on average, observationally in the streets. And actually, the reason why people do that is actually not to to give the disease to someone else. So if they know that they are sick and they are contagious, they would do it for the benefit of the society. Well, but of course for themselves as well, because when you are sick, your immune system is under attack and you don't want to get something else. So that would be the reasons. And even if we look at the Asian countries, there is this debate. This is the old debate, but now it has a new sparkle to it, right? So is it democracy or autocracy that is best, that is the best political system, or better, to cope with the pandemic? And theoretically, again, we have reasons to believe that it can be one or the other. So why it can be argued that autocracies are better at fighting the pandemic? So this is because these regimes have high ability to mobilize citizens, right? And they have high ability to monitor compliance with the rules. So compare China with the USA, right? In the US, there were a lot of protests against the attack on their freedoms, as some people would perceive, lockdowns, etc. But on the other hand, other political scientists and economists would say that you guys who argue that autocracy is better for pandemics, for fighting pandemics, are wrong, because you are missing the important piece. You are missing the role of information, right? It's not only ability to mobilize that matters. It's not only ability to monitor compliance, but it's also the freedom of information that is the cornerstone. And that would be an example of Taiwan. That they have this online mask availability application. They had daily conference between the scientists, the politicians, the public, and business, to see what's going on and how to handle it. They have Taiwan fact-checked center and a lot of other applications where you can trace what's going on, how many cases, locations with highest rate where you shouldn't go, etc. And so I love this quote. And usually when we talk with my students about politics and media, I also start with this quote about Gorbachev kind of dreaming probably of having, the Washington Post equivalent when Chernobyl disaster happened. Because when it happened, what was the first thing, almost the first thing that the local authorities did?
They turned off the telephone connection.
Exactly. Well, again, thank you. Again, different times, but old methods, because, cutting internet is also an authoritarian tool today. That's what the Chinese did when there were huge protests in the province of I forgot the province in how it's pronounced, Xinjiang, I think, in 2009. That was the government of Belarus recently did, so still using the methods. So that would be the success formula. And so we have discussed the role of information, and now what would be the consequences, the projected consequences, economic and political, of the pandemic? So a lot of analysts talk about the possibility of strengthening the role of the state in the economy. So it is evident now that the Scandinavian model, where they are able to combine kind of healthy competition with some basic, universal income, is the best model to fight such a pandemic. While some countries will face inevitably state deficit and debt growth, in terms of industry, we would see, the rise of online industry development? Well, we already seen it. It started before the pandemic. It's just that probably, the pandemic would accelerate it. And also there are some, there might be some good consequences, in a sense that the pandemic might, again, be a catalyst for example, the long-awaited, right, diversification of the economy in Russia, well, coupled with sanctions and coupled with the drop in oil prices. And also the healthcare reform in the US is also perceived right now by many as inevitable, because the system worked very poorly in comparison to other developed nations. In terms of the political implications, well, unfortunately, it's less rosy, and we expect continuation or strengthening of the authoritarian reversal that was already happening. Again, personally, I do not expect authoritarian reversal in democratic countries that were not on the authoritarian path before. But unfortunately, those that were, they might use pandemic as a pretext, right, to go forward with the authoritarian trends. And so one example would be Hungary, and the one author, Thomas Krause, he actually compared the new laws that were adopted in Hungary during the pandemic with the Ermächtungsgesetz in Germany. As you might remember, that's exactly the one that gave Hitler and Nazis much power. So they declared state of emergency for an unlimited time period. I mean, again, state of emergency might be a necessary measure, right, during the pandemic as this, but why for an unlimited time? Parliament may be suspended. Where does this come from? What Parliament did wrong during the pandemic. The police are free to use the data of the tax service without the approval of the Attorney General. Why is this necessary during the pandemic? No demonstrations. Well, if you have social distancing and if you are wearing masks, why that wouldn't be okay? Again, the powers of mayors may be revoked at any time. So you can see a lot of undemocratic steps here that can be interpreted as unnecessary, right? And then maybe the more long-term consequences that Sergei Medvedev would refer as moving towards biological panopticon, where, well, we might have embedded chips and the rating, the health ranking of people, as they are already doing in China in some provinces, social ranking of whether you are a good person or a bad person, and according to this ranking, your rights would be derived from the ranking, not from the constitution, right, which is obviously a violation of their rights. And unfortunately, other bad things might happen, such as growing distrust and xenophobia and racism, because during the epidemics, people start to blame one another for what's happening. Like, for example, in Michigan, there were protests. People were trying to protect their constitutional freedoms from lockdowns, maybe without understanding, why lockdowns were necessary. On the other hand, there were some good examples of local trust and civic initiatives, such as in Greece, that kind of really mobilized people and from bottom-up mobilization, and they got to help each other during the times of crisis. The less obvious implications, less talked about, would be implications for minorities in the social sense of minority, which also includes women, right, as a minority. So analysts predict that we will see, unfortunately, rise in the gender inequality, which will set us back in the achievements of feminism, which are modest in general. So setting back is even worse. So that would be, there are several explanations why we would see higher gender inequality. One is that there are different risks of losing a job according to different sectors, right? If you're employed in in service sector, probably the risk is higher. And in many countries, women would be much likely to be employed in these high risk sectors, such as service sector. So they will be more likely to get lose their jobs. Also, closing schools and closing kindergartens still would be a much higher burden in many countries for women than for men, who would still kind of go to work, and women will have to do both work and housework. There is a potential surge in domestic violence, and I believe that the European Commission, even as early as in the spring, they already documented the rise in the cases of domestic violence. Interestingly enough, such an efficient measure, actually it was efficient as in Peru and other countries, efficient for compliance with the rules. What they did, they said that during lockdown, women and men can go out on different days of the week. Well, that's smart in terms of economy, right? And in terms of how you can monitor compliance with the lockdown rules, because it's only men in the street. But then what about transgender people? And was it really about efficiency, economic, or was it about segregation, as some feminists thought about it? And another minority that was disproportionately, I would say, affected by the crisis, or is now affected, is the prison inmates. And there is a great project led by former HSC Professor Olga Zavelova. So you can read about her project in Novaya Gazeta, but they personally are gathering data for the prison riots, and they found that there was a huge increase worldwide in the prison riots, which might be due to hyper isolation and also not sanitary conditions and violation of the rights of the prisoners. Already, although it's about a year of the pandemic, we already see very interesting working papers coming out. And one that I wanted to talk to you about is the paper by Maxim Ananyev and Mikhail Poyker. They found that exposure to Fox News in the US hindered social distancing. So basically, in those cities or in those areas where those people who watch Fox News more are less likely to comply with the lockdown rules. So what do you know about the Fox News channel in the US? What is it? What reputation does it have?
It's Republican, kind of Republican channel.
Yeah, it's a biased channel, right? It's not neutral, and it is biased towards the views of the Republicans. Yes, exactly. So there are several papers that would explain why the US was doing, kind of so poorly in comparison to other developed nations. And one would be that there is widespread skepticism towards science, large income disparities, racial segregation, and there is evidence in general that all other things being equal, kind of the health outcomes in the African American population are in general worse than, the same health outcomes indicators in the white population in the US. So there is still this, well, racism is a huge problem, and racial segregation. And of course, another one would be mixed messages from the country's leadership regarding safety measures, right? Trump started with saying that it's just a flu and it will go away in a month. We just have to, stay together and face it, and it will go away, something like that. So they used a very interesting variation that makes this paper stand out. If we just look at people who watch Fox News, and if we have this connection that, the more people, the more time people spend watching Fox News, the less likely they comply with the rules. Can we talk about causality here? Why or why not? Or can we talk about the influence of Fox News on people? Or is there any other influence hidden here?
Maybe there might be much more factors that affect this people's, like, how they act.
More factors, okay. What about selection effect? Think about yourselves. So is it the TV program or internet videos that affect how you think, or do you choose to watch exactly that channel, or exactly do you choose to read that particular social media because it's similar, to what you believe? So here there is a problem that we don't know whether these people are choosing to watch Fox News, right? Because they are already Republican and they already want more freedom than lockdown. Or is it because they watch Fox News and what they see influences their actions? See the point? So we don't know this, but the paper used a very smart research design. So what they know, well, historically, is that Fox News, they came to different cities in the US at different time. And that's not because in some cities there was higher demand for Fox News. That wouldn't solve our problem, right? That was because of some other problem. That was because of exogenous problem in terms of historical cable lines. So basically, for technical reasons that I'm not a technical person, I don't know them, but for technical reasons, it was much easier and much cheaper for Fox News to enter one city than the other. So the reason why some people were watching Fox News much more is exogenous in this sense, right? It doesn't depend on their own decisions to watch it or not to watch it. So because of that, they used that data, and in order to trace, whether people complied with the rules or whether they did social distancing, they used smartphone data on traveling. So here are nice results. Look at the difference, Fox News and MSNBC, in terms of which words are most frequently were most frequently used. See, so for Fox News, that would be China, Chinese, right? And for MSNBC, kind of the more impartial channel, that would be health cases and outbreak. So kind of not too much about the origin of the virus. And here you can see that there is a nice difference between those most exposed to Fox News channel and less exposed to Fox News channel, right? So the blue line would be the top 10% Yes, and then the red line would be the bottom 10% exposure to the news. So yes, you can see that everyone had, less less distance traveled after on March 13th. It was, kind of declared rules for self-isolation, but the rate at which distance was decreasing is different for those who watch Fox News more and for those who watch it less. Another interesting paper says that one of the reasons, again, to comply with the lockdown and or not comply explanations would be disbelief in science. And what I like about the paper is how they measure disbelief in science. Again, they cannot measure directly because it would not be obvious whether it's just, their position on COVID or in general, they have this tendency to not to believe in scientific proofs. So they used as a proxy concentration of climate change skeptics. So I thought I would introduce to this paper. I thought that was very smart. And the very last thing I would quickly cover is the topic about COVID and populism. So there are two lines of thought here. One is that in general, populist leaders, they were worse in fighting the pandemic. The usual suspects would be who? The US, right? And Brazil as well, where Bolsonaro and his wife were among the protesters for freedom, and then they got sick. And the general line of thought would be that populism has a negative influence on health. Outcomes that would be for two reasons. One, disregard for science that we already discussed, and the second one would be their chauvinistic welfare policies. Well, in a sense that, for example, if that's the exclusionary populism that is against minorities and immigrant minorities, then there is high chance that immigrants would be denied access to healthcare or treated worse. And another line of thought is about how COVID-19 and how pandemic will influence populism in the future. So some would say, and there is a discussion, there is a debate. Some would say that actually it would lead to another wave of populism for the same reasons why populism was becoming popular in the first place, is that economic insecurity and less trust to each other. Again, in times of crisis, people will tend to blame each other for what's happening. But others would say that actually because populists did not do a good job, right, fighting the pandemic, people would blame their populist leaders, and more people who support mainstream parties would turn out to the elections. And so we might see the demise of populism, that people would come back to the mainstream parties. And I would like to end this talk on a more optimistic note, giving you the historical picture of different diseases that we talked about today. Right, so if the first one is that 14th century plague, the purple one, so what we were talking about today, the recent pandemic, would be that small red dot in the third row from above. So 1% mortality is still not that bad. So those who are interested, you guys can email me and I will send you the slides, because here I also have several appendix slides where I just recommend the data that you can use and the models, that some videos that you can watch on this topic from experts, some models, interactive models that you can play given different assumptions, how many people are sick, how many people are symptomatic, etc., etc. Yeah. So thank you very much for the attention.